Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching History of Russia Part 4 by Epic History TV. In last time's episode, we saw the reign of Catherine the Great and her many achievements, which led into the Napoleonic Wars, the reign and death of Alexander I, and we ended with the ascension of Nicholas I and the Decemberist Revolt. We're going into some very interesting times in Russian history. I'm excited to get into that. If you guys end up enjoying this video, I'd appreciate it if you would check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. And without any further ado, let's jump into this reaction. Alright, here we go. Part 4.
1825. Victory over Napoleon had confirmed Russia's status as a world power.
Yeah, at this point, Russia has risen to, as they said, the status of a world power, and frankly, following the Napoleonic Wars, Russia might have been the greatest world power. They were extremely powerful militarily. Alexander felt that, it was Russia who had defeated Napoleon, despite the fact that it was a group effort. It was an effort by the whole coalition. I can hear the train horn going off. Don't know if you guys can hear that through the mic. But Russia had really cemented its status as a great power. And of course it would continue as a great power through the end of the 20th century, but it really hit a high point here. There will be valleys and more highs in the future. So this is a very interesting period of Russian history. There's a lot of chaos, a lot of conflict, but Russia is really rising to the top, and we're going to see that in these next couple of videos.
But there was discontent within Russia amongst intellectuals and army officers, some of whom had formed secret societies to plot the overthrow of Russia's autocratic system.
Yes, though to be clear, this Decemberist Uprising was a big deal, but to be honest, it wasn't that big a deal. Now, compared to the rest of Europe, Russia's educated class was extraordinarily small. And keep in mind that in the rest of Europe, the educated class is still a very small percentage of the entire population. Most of these European countries at the moment are still just peasants, with a very small group of educated men who hold a lot of the power, being nobles, and at this point, a lot of bourgeois middle-class individuals, lawyers, accountants, business owners. In Russia, they're not even at that point. The Russian population is made up of 80 to 90% peasants, and a high percentage of that group is serfs, who have basically no rights. They are close to slaves in many respects. They're held to the land. Russia really does not have a well-developed middle class, does not have a well-developed bourgeoisie, and so these intellectuals who are dissenting against the government are almost entirely the noble class, the very small aristocracy that Russia does have. So yes, the Decemberist Uprising was a big deal. It was certainly a threat to the Tsar, but it wasn't that much of a threat. It was very unlikely it was going to work, and it was a very small percentage of the population.
When Emperor Alexander was succeeded, not as expected by his brother Constantine, but by a younger brother, Nicholas.
Constantine did not want the job. There was a lot of confusion after Alexander died about who's going to be the next Tsar. People thought it would be Constantine, and Constantine was like, nope, I don't want it, it's not me. And behind the scenes, it was sort of worked out that it was going to be Nicholas and not Constantine, but in public, there was a lot of chaos and confusion.
One of these secret societies used the confusion to launch a military coup. But the Decemberist Revolt, as it became known, was defeated by loyalist troops, and the ringleaders were hanged.
Yeah, I mean, we watched Epic History TV's videos on the Decemberist Uprising, some fantastic videos, and as we saw in those, the uprisings were just really badly organized. They just couldn't manage to bring people together. They couldn't manage to make their revolt appeal to the general population. And so the Decemberist Uprising only appealed to this very small percentage of discontented army officers and nobles. And so it didn't have popular support, it was badly organized, it was just a mess overall. But it's still noteworthy. It's noteworthy that these nobles were getting liberal ideas in their heads. And they were getting these liberal ideas, by the way, from Western Europe. A lot of these young army officers had served in the Napoleonic Wars, during which they had basically toured Europe. They dined in the cafes of Paris, talked with the locals, and when they were talking, some of them were picking up some of these Enlightenment ideas of liberty and democracy and all that dangerous stuff that they were slowly bringing back to Russia.
Others were sent into internal exile in Siberia. This was to become a common sentence for criminals and political prisoners.
Yes, it would. This was one of the favorite punishments of the Russian czars. Instead of execution, they would send these people to Siberia. A lot of political dissidents were sent to Siberia. And in fact, some of the Decemberists and a lot of political dissidents were given mock executions, where they were brought up to a firing squad or to the galleys, and it looked like they were going to be hung or shot right there and then someone would rush in and say, "I've got a pardon from the Tsar. You're going to be exiled to Siberia instead." This was a common tactic that the Tsars loved to use. And, in terms of internal exile, well, if you've got such a big country and this massive underpopulated area, I guess it's better to just send your political dissidents over there than sending them abroad. I mean, you can keep an eye on them, and they probably won't cause any more trouble. Though, of course, there are many political figures, Lenin might be the best example, who were sent into exile in Siberia and came back more enthused and more radical. So maybe it wasn't the most effective, but it did silence many a revolutionary and many a dissident.
In Tsarist Russia, Nicholas went on to adopt an official doctrine of orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality.
Now, this is what I was saying last time. I don't think Alexander I was really liberal in effect. He talked a big game, didn't actually implement any liberal policy. But Nicholas, of course, he also wasn't liberal, but not only did he act in a conservative absolutist fashion, but his rhetoric was extremely conservative. I mean, he would always harp on these three things: orthodoxy, autocracy, nationality. That is what the Russian Empire meant to him. He was very much into this autocratic, chosen by God idea of the Russian Tsar and the Russian Empire. So he really played into that with both his words and his actions.
The state was to rest on the pillars of church, Tsar, and the Russian national spirit, a clear rejection of the values of European liberalism. In the Caucasus, border clashes with Persia led to a war which ended in complete Russian victory.
Yep, once again we see Russia expanding further southwards. And on those values from Nicholas, he certainly did reject Western liberalism, and this is when we begin to see this major rise of the Slavophile versus Westernizer debate. Slavophiles who wanted to keep everything Russian, they wanted their own conservative Russian empire with the Tsar in complete control, and these Western-style liberals who wanted to move towards a constitutional monarchy or maybe even a democracy. But to be clear, the Russian Tsar was not necessarily a fan of the Slavophiles. The Russian Tsars, particularly someone like Nicholas, while he was very conservative and he wanted absolute power, he also wanted a sort of modernizing, respected global country. He didn't want to be assigned to the backwater of history. He wanted Russia to be amongst equals with the other great powers. So he didn't really like these Slavophiles. He wanted to be seen as a great monarch alongside the other rulers of Europe. He just wanted to do it as an orthodox autocrat. So it's sort of an interesting interplay here.
The Treaty of Turkmenchay forced Persia to cede all its territories in the region to Russia and pay a large indemnity. Russian support for Greece in its war of independence against the Ottomans led to war between Russia and the Ottoman Empire.
Yep, and we watched Kings and Generals videos on the Greek War of Independence. God, it seems like for every topic they bring up, we have some relevant reactions. But, to be clear, it took a lot of convincing to get Russia involved in the Greek War of Independence. As you can see, it went on for many years before Russia agreed to help out, because following the French Revolution, the great powers, including Russia, really were not that interested in helping more liberal revolutionaries, which is what the Greek rebels were. But eventually, they fought for long enough, and European great powers didn't care about the Ottoman Empire, so they eventually stepped in to resolve the situation. They erred on the side of the Greeks, and of course they, dominated the Ottoman Empire for their own benefits, something that would continue throughout, the remainder of the Ottoman Empire's history, as I'm sure we'll see in these videos.
Russian victory brought further gains in the Black Sea region. A Polish revolt, led by young army officers, was crushed by Russian troops.
Yep.
Alexander Pushkin, Russia's greatest poet, was shot in a duel, and 2 days later died from his wounds. Nicholas sent troops to help put down a Hungarian revolt against Austrian rule.
Yep. I'm not gonna, talk a lot about 1848. We have another reaction on 1848, actually. But, a wave of liberal revolts across Europe. Ultimately, they failed, largely due to sort of discord amongst the revolutionaries. They couldn't bring themselves together, which allowed for conservatives to respond and crush the revolts. And the Russian Empire played a big role in crushing these revolts throughout Europe. I mean, they were perhaps the most notable of these religious conservative monarchs, but they were in good company throughout Europe.
The emperor's willingness to help suppress liberal revolts won him the nickname the gendarme, or policeman of Europe.
Yeah.
Russia's first major railway was opened, connecting St. Petersburg and Moscow. Alexander Herzen, a leading intellectual critic of Russia's autocracy, emigrated to London, where he continued to call for reform in his homeland. He'd later be described as the father of Russian socialism.
Yeah, pretty important figure. Though he wasn't really that influential in his time, as we're getting towards maybe the ends of his life and the end of the 19th century, his influence would start to be more widespread as socialism became far more popular in Russia. He also starts, this sort of tradition of these radicals being exiled from Russia and then writing their pamphlets and books in exile. A lot of Russian socialists would go into exile in Switzerland, for example, but his influence will definitely be felt down the line.
The Ottoman Empire, now known as the sick man of Europe, reacted to further Russian provocations by declaring war.
Yeah, bad idea. Bad idea for the Ottomans.
Black Sea Fleet inflicted a crushing defeat on the Turks at the Battle of Sinope. But Britain and France, alarmed at Russia's southern expansion and potential control of Constantinople, declared war on Russia.
And don't get the wrong idea, Britain and France had no love for the Ottoman Empire. Frankly, they didn't really care about it, but they did see it as sort of a bulwark against Russian influence in the region. And so, they didn't mind if the Ottoman Empire was extremely weak, but they still wanted it to exist because it prevented, at least to a certain extent, further Russian domination of the Balkans and the Caucasus. And this also comes back to something we mentioned far earlier in the series, how Moscow and Russia saw itself as the third Rome. We have the capitals of Rome and the capitals of Christianity. The first was Rome, the second was Constantinople, and after Constantinople fell to the Ottomans, the Russians felt that Moscow was the third. And so, of course it would be a massive symbolic move for them to recapture Constantinople, sort of the center of Orthodox Christianity. And as we know, Orthodoxy is one of the three pillars of the empire. It's so important to them. So, of course, they just want to extend their empire and extend their base of power for those reasons alone, but there's also massive symbolic and religious reasons that they want to continue to extend southward.
The Allies landed troops in Crimea and besieged the naval base of Sevastopol, which fell after a grueling year-long siege.
Yeah.
In the Baltic, British and French warships blockaded the Russian capital, St. Petersburg. Russia was forced to sign a humiliating peace.
And so this went from Russia dominating the Ottomans to Britain and France dominating Russia. And this ended up being very humiliating for Russia. And the Crimean War also ended up being, for Russians, sort of a sign that they were backwards. Their army wasn't modernized. And so this spurred, people in power. They wanted Russia to be up to scratch with the other great powers. They didn't want to be embarrassed and humiliated again. They wanted to be one of the big boys on the block. And they were. But they needed to be more powerful than this. They can't be getting pushed around by puny Britain and France, right? So this sort of inspired a bit of a crisis.
Withdraw its forces from the Black Sea and put on hold plans for further southern expansion. Nicholas I was succeeded by his son, Alexander II.
Alexander II, who many would say would continue the liberal legacy of Alexander I. I've already talked about how I feel like Alexander I wasn't really liberal. Alexander II will be more of an actual liberal, though. He's still an autocrat Russian czar, so keep that in mind.
The Crimean War had exposed Russia's weakness. The country lagged far behind its European rivals in industry, infrastructure, and military power. So Alexander, unlike his father, decided to embrace reform. The most obvious sign of Russia's backwardness was serfdom. According to the 1857 census, more than a third of Russians were serfs.
Yeah, and at this point, this is the mid-1800s, serfdom has really been going out of style since the 1700s in the rest of Europe. Now, some vestiges of serfdom and feudalism would remain, after that century, but serfdom had mostly been abolished by that point. Same thing with a lot of slavery around the world. By the mid-1800s, it was, viewed very badly to have slavery still going. Look at America. And so America and Russia, America's got slavery until the 1860s, and Russia's got serfdom until about the same time. So they're both sort of behind the times on that one.
Forced to work their master's land, with few rights, restrictions on movement, and their status passed down to their children.
Of course, at this point, a lot of Western European countries are beginning to quickly industrialize. Britain's ahead of everybody, but in Britain, the urban population is quickly rising, and the rural population is dropping, so they have less peasants to worry about anyway. And of course, they don't really have serfs anymore, but the peasants that are remaining, well, a lot of them are flooding into the cities to become urban workers. So the whole dynamic is changing, but Russia is still extremely rural and agricultural at this point.
They were slaves in all but name.
Yeah.
In 1861, Alexander II abolished serfdom in Russia. He was hailed as the liberator.
Yes.
But in reality, most former serfs remained trapped in servitude and poverty.
Alexander also made the serfs pay off debts to their masters, because the Russian aristocracy had just lost a bunch of free labor, and so he thought, well, it would be unfair to have them lose that free labor without compensation. So in reality, it's in some ways similar to the fate of the slaves in America. You end slavery, but a lot of the slaves stay as sharecroppers, indebted to their former masters. In Russia, a lot of the serfs stay on their former estates and work for their former masters, having to pay off these massive debts. So, sure, a lot has changed. This is a big deal. But in reality, day-to-day life, a lot of it is pretty similar to what it was before abolition of serfdom.
Alexander's reforms would continue with the creation of the Zemstva, provincial assemblies with authority over local affairs.
I mean, this stuff is a big deal, right? These reforms are a massive deal. Now, Russia still had a unitary autocratic government. These zemstvas did not have, too much local authority. They didn't really have authority to legislate. But this is the biggest devolution of power we have seen, perhaps ever, in the history of modern Russia. Prior reformers, Peter, Catherine, Alexander I, if you want to call him a reformer, these people did not let go of any power at all. They were autocrats that really held on to their absolute power. Alexander II, he is still an autocrat, but he is giving up a little bit of power. I mean, this is the most political organizing Russia's ever seen. So this is a pretty big deal. Of course, this trend won't really continue, but this is still a big deal.
Including education and social welfare. In the Far East, Russia forced territorial concessions from a weakened China, leading to the founding of Vladivostok, Russia's major Pacific port.
I mean, we're really getting into the era of European imperialism. We're getting to the point where a lot of Asia and Africa will be colonized by Europe. At this point, China is basically crumbling pretty quickly. This has been happening for a while now. The 19th century is really a terrible time for China. Their government's losing power. There's a lot of different rebellions, and these European powers are taking advantage of that, including Russia, to get better trade deals, to take territory, just to take whatever China's losing because the government cannot control its own territory.
Another uprising by Poles and Lithuanians against Russian rule was once more crushed by the Russian army.
Yeah.
In the Caucasus, Russia's long and brutal war against local tribes came to an end, with their leaders swearing oaths of loyalty to the Tsar. In Central Asia, the Russian Empire was gradually expanding southwards. Russian armies defeated the Emirate of Bukhara and the Khanate of Khiva, and by the 1880s, Russia had conquered most of what was then called Turkestan.
Jesus, I mean, such a massive empire. Though if you look at it, this territory, a lot of this southernmost territory in Central Asia and the Caucasus is now independent. They're independent countries. And to be fair, particularly this region of Central Asia, it wasn't conquered that long ago. It's really remarkable how quickly the Russian Empire expanded during this time period. And of course, the war in the Caucasus was over, but like I mentioned before, there's still a lot of tension and conflict between the Caucasus region and Russia, the Russian government, particularly between Chechnya and Russia. There's been several wars in recent years. There's been a lot of abuses of Chechnyans by the Russian military, so still a lot of conflict going on.
Today, the countries of Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan. Imperial rivalry in Central Asia between Russia and Britain led to the Great Game, a 19th century version of the Cold War. Centered on Afghanistan, diplomats and spies on both sides tried to win local support, extend their own influence, and limit the expansion of their rival.
Yeah, though this is a much smaller scale and of much less importance than the Cold War. I do kind of understand the comparison, but I always thought it was kind of a funny comparison. But it is kind of funny that you have Britain and Russia competing over territory in Central Asia. They're both so far away from the centers of their empire. I mean, Britain is an island and off the coast of Western Europe, and Russia is centered around, the Moscow-St. Petersburg area. They're just so far out of their depth, but they have so much power that they can colonize all these different countries around the world. I mean, Britain's the best example of that, but even Russia, with its land empire, expanded so much.
While avoiding direct military confrontation, Russia decided to sell Alaska to America for $7.2 million. Many Americans thought it was a waste of money. Gold and oil were only discovered there much later.
Yeah, the the American official who went through with the deal was named Seward. And at the time, this deal was called Seward's Folly, because a lot of Americans thought it was a stupid idea. You know, why are we paying this much money? It wasn't that much money, but this much money for this big block of ice. Well, down the line, we found gold and the ever-precious oil, so it ended up that Seward had been right. I mean, he probably didn't know it, but it ended up being a really good deal. America gets a lot of these really good deals, like the Louisiana Purchase. You know, we're just buying massive chunks of territory for relatively low amounts of money, considering the amount of land we're getting.
Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace was published, still regarded as one of the world's greatest works of literature.
Yeah, it's interesting. Russia really has its own sort of independent culture. It also has this idea of a Eurasian culture. It's a lot more complicated than a lot of European countries who have their own culture, but then they're aware that they're part of this larger European, culture or society. But as you can see, a lot of Russian writers, poets, artists have been so influential throughout the world, particularly so influential in European culture as a whole. You know, they're clearly tied to the rest of Europe.
The late 19th century was a cultural golden age for Russia, a period of literary greats and outstanding composers. Russia, in support of nationalist revolts in the Balkans against Ottoman rule, went to war with the Ottoman Empire once.
Yep, and we've talked about this before, but once again, you always got to touch on the Orthodox Christianity because it's so important for Russia. In this region, you know, currently under the domination of the Ottomans, there were a lot of Orthodox Christians, whether they be Bulgars or Serbs or Greeks. There's still a lot of Greeks within the Ottoman Empire. And so Russia uses that as an excuse to get involved. They say, and they signed that treaty with the Ottoman Empire like 100 years ago that sort of set them up as the guarantor of the rights of Orthodox Christians. And so Russia is saying, well, we have interests in this region. We have to protect our Orthodox brothers. And so, sorry Ottomans, we've got to get involved and we're going to beat your ass again.
Once more. Russian troops crossed the Danube. Then, with Bulgarian help, fought to secure the vital Shipka Pass. Then they launched a bloody 5-month siege of Plevna in Bulgaria. Russia and her allies finally won victory, with their troops threatening Constantinople itself. But at the Congress of Berlin, Russia bowed to international pressure and accepted limited gains.
Once again, the rest of Europe wanted to prevent Russian domination in this region because they fear Russia becoming too powerful. The Congress of Berlin was also the famous Congress when Europe basically carved up Africa. They drew a bunch of arbitrary borders and said, okay, Britain, you get this, France, you get this, Belgium, you get, etc., etc. So Britain Britain especially, but Europe, the European great powers, is currently toying with the fate of Africa and the Balkans, and a lot of the world.
In a settlement that also led to independence for Romania, Serbia, Montenegro, and later Bulgaria.
Yes, as you can tell, these countries' borders will end up looking very different down the line. If you look at a modern map of the Balkans, these countries do not look the same at all. There's going to be a lot of warfare, a lot of ethnic cleansing, a lot of massacres, a lot of fighting, a lot of population exchanges, and those borders are going to move around a lot.
Meanwhile, within Russia, radical political groups were increasingly frustrated by Alexander II's limited reforms. There were several failed attempts to assassinate the emperor.
Yep.
But as he prepared to approve...
I mean, this is an era of radicalism globally. You know, we see the rise of socialism, communism, anarchism. We see the rise of terrorist groups and assassinations of political officials. I mean, if we're looking at the late 1800s into like the mid-1900s, such a high rate of assassination of political officials and political acts of terror in at least in Europe and America that I'm aware of. So this is a global trend, but we do see a lot of this terrorism in Russia as well.
New constitutional reforms. He was killed in St. Petersburg by a bomb thrown by members of the People's Will, one of the world's first modern terrorist groups.
Oh, that's nice.
This act of violence would lead only to a new era of repression.
That's true.
Did you know?
Yeah, about that murder, a lot of people say, you know, well, you murdered the best chance you had for liberalism in Russia, and now you get a conservative. Which is true. Though, to be fair, Alexander II was still an autocrat who held on to the roots of the Russian Empire. He was not some radical liberal reformer. He did have some impressive and important reforms, but he did make sure that things stayed relatively the same. So, you know, it's not like he was the very image of liberalism and Western-style reform. But after he was executed, after he was assassinated, worse was to come. So you can interpret that however you will. Yeah, this was a good one. You know, Russian history is just very interesting. You know, we've got part 5 and then the revolution. So I will be excited to get into those ones. If you guys enjoyed this one, once again, please check out the Patreon, leave a like, and subscribe to the channel. I hope you guys are all having a good day today, and I will see you again next time. Goodbye.